We've pretty much heard nothing about professions in Legion, other than that they're working on them with a lot bigger team than they've ever had before. Plus, garrisons won't be attached to professions because, well, Blizzard knows that garrisons are so fail. Beyond that, unfortunately, the only thing I can say in this video about professions is to react to how professions were in Warlords and what I'd like to see in Legion. I touched on my thoughts on Warlords of Draenor's profession in my retrospective, but, well, there's more to be said. First off, there have always been items in the game that require a cooldown to craft them. They've been around since vanilla. I mean, there was refined deep rock salt and mooncloth, for instance. But they were rare in vanilla, but then again they got more common in the Burning Crusade, Wrath, and later stuff like Titan Steel and Primal Mooncloth became required for each profession's high-end content. These cooldown items made crafted items more valuable because they took time as well as resources to make. But Blizzard went overboard with that gated item philosophy in Warlords, since just about the only part you could make for your profession was that gated once-a-day part. I kind of felt like this was a double-edged sword. In previous expansions, engineers had to wait until they got their skill to a certain level before they could craft interesting and fun stuff like guns and epic-level goggles. With the new system, you could choose to learn those early on in your progression and get them sooner, but at the same time, getting gear sooner meant there was less reward for maxing out your profession skill. What maxing out your skill got you in Warlords, instead of nice gear at the end of the progression, was being able to make more of that single type of part your profession offered you. Essentially, we were getting rewarded with a number, not a thing, when we maxed out our skills, and to be honest, getting a thing is more fun and feels more rewarding than getting the number. And, well, let's face it, the fact that you could only make one of these per day needlessly dragged out the progression of maxing your profession out. To be honest, the biggest problem I have with the new profession system of having just one component you make on a daily cooldown, it's not just that it's daily, it's the lack of variety of components that felt strange and disappointing. I mean, let's look at epic level guns from previous expansions. Each one required a variety of high-end components to make it. By contrast, the epic gun from Warlords required 100 gears? How do you make 100 gears into a gun? It doesn't make sense. Note, if there's an actual answer to this question, do not answer it. The government will think you're a terrorist or some other kind of psycho. It isn't just engineering that had this issue with a lack of variety of components. Jewelers only got one gemstone to work with. Part of that is the fact that Blizzard redid socketed items so that sockets were a rare occurrence on gear, but to be honest, that just took away from the variety of the game too. I mean, even with only 6 choices for what to put in a given socket, 9 times out of 10, you're going to be using that small choice you have for min-maxing. Which is what people use the old sockets for as well most of the time, but at least there was more flexibility, more choices, and more variety in the old system. Plus, having 6 different colors of raw gems available for me made things like scopes and goggles very varied. So even though I'm not really a jeweler, I'm hoping that we go back to the older system. There was one thing that did add some variety back into Warlords' professions, and that was the fact that elemental items made a comeback. For that matter, the ability to mine stuff other than just ore made a comeback too, and I was glad to see stone drop from mining nodes again for the first time since vanilla. Though, I was kinda disappointed that the only thing you can use stone for is to get more out of it. The way Blizzard implemented elemental items in Warlords made for an interesting variation too. In vanilla, green level elemental items would drop off of elemental enemies once in a blue moon, if you were lucky. That grindy and unsatisfying system got revamped in the Burning Crusade when they made white level motes drop off of enemies in mining nodes, and then you can combine 10 white level motes into a single green level primal. That was more satisfying since you saw yourself making progress toward getting the needed materials more often, so getting motes felt more rewarding, and the fact that engineers could get some motes other professions couldn't get made for a fun twist. But there were 7 types of motes in the Burning Crusade, and each one could only become one type of primal, that is until you bring transmutes into the mix. This system stayed pretty much the same in every subsequent expansion, with a few variations, like how Cataclysm had only motes and no primals, and how Mists had only one elemental items to speak of. But in Warlords, there was exactly one kind of mote, a Primal Spirit, but taking this one kind of mote to a vendor would allow you to convert it into any one of 4 different elemental items. This was simple and satisfactory, but there's one problem. there's a much more valuable item that's needed for crafting: Savage Blood. I guess in terms of rarity and necessity for high-end items, Savage Blood is on par with things like Primal Nethers or Chaos Orbs, except that Primal Nethers and Chaos Orbs dropped from Heroics, thus giving players an incentive to go into Heroics. Savage Blood, by contrast, was something you either got from a specific garrison building, or else you had to spend Primal Spirits to get them. The fact that Savage Blood was in such high demand, and the fact that you could spend Primal Spirits to get them, meant that it felt like you had to save all your Primal Spirits to get Savage Blood, and thus you couldn't spend Primal Spirits on elemental items. So the very presence of Savage Blood on that vendor cut players off from the slick one moat to buy them all system. If Blizzard decides to stick with the one moat to buy them all system, I hope they don't make the mistake of putting other items on the vendor that crowd out the elemental items. To be honest, getting elemental items from making cooldown profession items myself, or by having my garrison make them for me, was my main source of elemental items instead. That random chance that you got had its positive and negative aspects. Positive in that it encourages you to use your cooldown daily, negative in that you never knew what you'd get, or, after patch 6.2, whether what you got would actually be useful. But a bigger negative than that is the fact that the daily cooldowns in general cut into the variety that previous expansions got us, so doing more to tie the profession to the daily cooldowns is generally a bad idea. But one thing I absolutely loved about professions in Warlords. Back in the Burning Crusade, there were recipes that allowed engineers to upgrade their purple level goggles to keep those crafted items up with cutting-edge raid content. And now, every profession has upgrade items that let them do the same thing. This upgrade system is excellent, even if its revisions in patch 6.2 had the drawback of giving each profession a useless elemental item, and I'm hoping that upgrades stick around in Legion. All in all, professions in Warlords felt like a large structure with pillars that leaned heavily on each other, but the structure has so many problems I'm hoping they tear it down and build something better in its place in Legion. Some things that I'd like to see in Legion are, well, first and foremost, variety. In Warlords, there were fewer medals, fewer parts, fewer things I had to do in order to progress with my professions, fewer bombs, fewer or even no gadgets that did something when I clicked on them. All in all, there was a lot less variety in Warlords. Sure, the Stealthman and the Shieldtronic were new, but they didn't add that much to the game. Another thing that I'd like to see in Legion is a real dichotomy between Goblin and Gnomish engineering. I've been complaining about that for years now. Plus, Blizzard never really gave gnomes a chance at light-based technology, which the developers were promising as far back as Cataclysm. Man, this game is starting to feel old. One more thing I'd like to see is uses of elemental items in each recipe that make a kind of sense. You see, engineering during 6.0 and 6.1 could make link grease lock sprockets or true iron triggers using sorceress fire, and they could make Blackrock rifling or Morden's magnificent contraption using sorceress air. Each of those items was something to upgrade either goggles or a gun, but when you stop and think about it, why is an air elemental item required to make Blackrock rifling? Wouldn't fire have made more sense because you can at least smelt metals with fire? And any of the other contraptions. It's not clear or even implied why the elements were needed. If the link grease lock sprocket were instead called a thermal lens enhancer, it would have made sense that fire was needed to make it. Or if the Blackrock rifling had been called air-sanded rifling instead, then the elemental air would have made sense too. When I take a step back and look at this suggestion, it's clear that the only difference I'm really asking for is in how these items are named, and maybe the art in the icons. 400 years ago, Shakespeare asked the question, "What's in a name?" and it looks like the answer is quite a lot, actually. As for the setting for Legion, Blizzard is apparently taking an archipelago of islands and calling it a continent. It doesn't make sense to me to call an archipelago a continent, to be honest, but then again, what choice does Blizzard really have when settling on a place to put the new content in this expansion? Besides, for a Burning Legion-centered expansion, the Broken Isles are an excellent choice, since they already have a history with the Burning Legion, and it's where the last Guardian of Tirisfal buried Sargeras' body. So I have to say, the setting makes sense as far as the story goes. It also gives Blizzard a chance to invent new races and stories for them, since it's a new area on Azeroth that the Alliance and Horde haven't seen before. Now, one of the big problems that Mists of Pandaria was trying to address was the fact that just about everything in World of Warcraft up till then was built on lore that was established in the real-time strategy games. In Mists, they were trying to invent some brand new lore of their own that had never or barely been seen in the real-time strategy games. By contrast, Warlords was going back to the real-time strategy roots in a lot of ways, exploring characters and zones that had been long gone in the Warcraft lore, which almost seemed to be the polar opposite of Mist's goal of creating new lore. Legion seems to be a mixed bag of old and new lore. On the one hand, the Burning Legion has been pulling strings since Warcraft 1, so there's nothing new about having them as the main antagonists. And the Broken Isles is also a place we've been to before in the real-time strategy games a couple of times. But on the other hand, the tidbits of story the developers have parted with tell us that they're going to be showing us some brand new Titan technology called the Pillars of Creation with a brand new backstory about something that happened 12,000 years ago instead of 10,000. So Legion will apparently be a balance of existing and new lore. We hope. Also, since it's taking place on islands, this gives Blizzard a chance to review some of the older races that have to do with the ocean, like the seaweed Vrykul, the Naga, and of course the iconic Murlocs. The fact that there's a Naga biography on the site that isn't Ajara is promising that there will be a future expansion where Ajara will be the main antagonist, and where Sea Witches were the new hero class. I've talked before about how I think Ajara is an often overlooked villain who would make an excellent main antagonist for an expansion, plus, well, I've had a whole video explaining why I think Sea Witches are a good hero class for WoW, so I won't go into that here. Besides, this video is supposed to be about Legion, and Sea Witches certainly aren't going to be a playable hero class in Legion. It's pretty clear that there's going to be a large variety of environments to play through in the Broken Isles, and in video games in general, a game's variety is important. Variety is the reason why Mario games have worlds with different themes after all, and with mountains, woods, beaches, and ruins, Legion can deliver on that variety. Though, I certainly hope there's a good variety in the dungeons. Mist was lacking in variety when it came to dungeons, while Warlords was better than Mist, it still wasn't on par with older expansions like the Burning Crusade or Wrath, and I'd like to have seen more dungeons. Hopefully time walking will be a more regular event in Legion, since time walking allows Blizzard to revisit older content that was and is good and recycle it for audiences that may never have played through it before. Time walking also adds challenge since you can't overgear time walking dungeons. There are so many things in Legion that we won't know what to expect until after we've dived into the expansion, and hopefully that's a good thing. Blizzard may surprise us with an excellent expansion this time, and only time will tell whether this make-or-break expansion makes or breaks the game.